Imagine standing on the windy cliffs of southern England in the summer of 1588. Below you, the sea is restless. Dark waves rising and crashing as though the ocean itself is waiting for something extraordinary to happen. Across the horizon, sails appear, hundreds of them, vast and imposing, each one a floating fortress bristling with cannons. This is no ordinary fleet. This is the Spanish Armada, a naval power unlike anything Europe had ever seen, and its mission is to crush England. At first glance, it seemed impossible that a small island kingdom could resist such force. Spain was the most powerful empire in the world at the time, overflowing with wealth from the Americas, boasting vast armies, and possessing the most formidable navy afloat. England, in contrast, was still finding its footing on the global stage. Its navy was innovative, but far smaller. Its resources stretched thin, and its young queen, Elizabeth I, faced threats not only from Spain, but also from within her own realm. Yet, as history would prove, the outcome of this monumental clash would not be decided solely by ships or soldiers. It would be decided by the weather. To understand how the winds and storms of the North Atlantic reshaped history, you need to step back and see the larger picture. This was not merely a war about power or money. It was a struggle rooted in religion, politics, and pride. Spain's King Philip II considered himself the defender of Catholicism, determined to bring Protestant England back under Rome's influence. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic claimant to Elizabeth's throne, further infuriated him. He saw England as rebellious, heretical, and dangerously defiant of his rule. The Armada was not just a fleet, it was a divine mission in Philip's eyes. Blessed by God to restore what he believed was the true faith, England, on the other hand, was a nation bracing for invasion. Queen Elizabeth I may have been underestimated by her rivals, but she understood the stakes. For her, survival depended on inspiring her people and making use of every advantage. She could not match Spain ship for ship, but she could rely on cunning strategy, lighter and faster ships, and, most importantly, the unpredictable weather of the English Channel. The Armada itself was staggering in scale. About 130 ships, carrying nearly 30,000 men, sailed from Spain. It was a floating city, with galleons and hulks laden with supplies, soldiers, and weapons meant for the conquest of England. The plan was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. Sail up through the Channel, link up with Spanish forces stationed in the Netherlands, and then ferry them across to invade England. The sight of the Armada must have struck fear into anyone who gazed upon it. Even in peacetime, such a fleet was a marvel of engineering. In war, it looked unstoppable. But nature has a way of humbling even the mightiest plans. From the very start, the Armada struggled against the elements. Strong winds delayed its departure from Spain, scattering ships before they had even reached the open seas. Crews grew restless, food spoiled, and disease began to spread in the cramped holds. Sailors, who were often pressed into service against their will, grew weak and weary. Yet Philip pushed forward, convinced that God would guide his fleet to victory. When the Armada finally entered the Channel, the English Navy was ready. Using smaller, more agile ships, the English harassed the larger Spanish vessels, darting into fire volleys of cannon shot before retreating out of reach. It was a style of naval warfare unfamiliar to the Spaniards, who preferred to close in, board enemy ships, and fight hand-to-hand. Instead, they found themselves being worn down, slowly, methodically, like predators harassing a wounded beast. Still, the Armada pressed on. Despite the setbacks, it managed to hold its formation, a great crescent shape that allowed it to protect its more vulnerable supply ships. For days, the two navies clashed along the Channel, with neither side able to land a decisive blow. The Armada's goal remained clear: reach the Netherlands and unite with the Duke of Parma's forces for the invasion of England. But then came the turning point, an attack in the dead of night that shattered Spanish confidence. The English, knowing the Armada was anchored off Calais, launched fire ships into their midst. Old vessels packed with tar, pitch, and explosives were set ablaze and sent drifting toward the Spanish fleet. In the darkness, panic spread. Captains cut their anchors to escape the fiery menace, scattering the armada into chaos. By morning, the tight crescent formation was gone, replaced by a confused and vulnerable fleet. It was then that the weather delivered its first decisive blow. Strong winds swept across the channel, pushing the disorganized armada further north. Unable to regroup effectively, the Spaniards faced relentless English pursuit. Battle after battle weakened them, cannon fire tearing through hulls, masts splintering, and men falling overboard into the cold sea. And still, the wind carried them away from safety. The decisive clash came near Gravelines. Here, the English attacked with fury, their ships darting in and out, unleashing broadsides at close range. The Spaniards fought bravely, but their massive ships, designed for boarding rather than long-range gunnery, were at a disadvantage. The storm winds picked up again, scattering ships and preventing any organized counterattack. By the end, the armada was battered, broken, and retreating northward, not toward victory, but toward disaster. Yet the true destruction had not even begun. As the armada fled north around Scotland and Ireland, they found themselves at the mercy of the Atlantic storms. Winds howled, waves crashed, and rain lashed the decks. Many ships were driven onto rocky coasts, splintering into pieces. Survivors staggered ashore, only to be captured or killed. Others perished in the freezing waters, unable to fight against the sea's relentless pull. By the time the survivors limped back to Spain, the armada was a shadow of its former self. Of the 130 ships that had set sail, less than half returned. Thousands of men were dead, and Spain's dream of conquering England had been dashed not by English guns alone, but by the merciless power of the weather. The story of the Spanish Armada is often told as a clash of empires, of Protestant England standing against Catholic Spain, of Elizabeth I's defiance against Philip II's ambition. But when you strip away the politics and the pride, what remains is a humbling lesson. The greatest fleet in the world could not overcome the forces of nature. And so, the question lingers: if storms had not scattered the armada, if the winds had been calmer, would England have fallen under Spanish rule? Would history itself have turned down an entirely different path? As the battered armada turned northward after the battle off Gravelines, the Spaniards faced not just defeat, but catastrophe. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, who had commanded the fleet, despite having little naval experience, now had one desperate goal: to bring as many ships home as possible. The invasion was no longer possible. Survival was the only option. Yet the sea, which had already humbled the armada, was not finished with them. The retreat took the armada into the treacherous waters of the North Sea. Here, winds howled across the gray expanse, driving ships further away from safety. With English vessels still shadowing them, the Spaniards pushed north, hugging the coast of Scotland in hopes of circling around the British Isles and returning to Spain. But the conditions only worsened. Cold rains lashed the decks, sails tore under the strain, and water poured into leaking hulls. The men, already starving and sick, were now soaked, shivering, and desperate. Ships that had once seemed invincible were reduced to fragile shells, creaking and groaning under the weight of the storm. Many lacked anchors, having cut them loose during the fire ship attack at Calais. Without anchors, they could not stabilize themselves near safe harbors. Every time they tried to seek shelter, the sea swept them back out into open water. It was as if the ocean itself was determined to keep them from rest. By the time the armada reached the waters off Ireland, disaster struck on a scale few could have imagined. Storm after storm pounded the fleet, scattering ships across the jagged western coast. Galleons smashed against rocks, their hulls breaking apart like toys. Survivors clung to wreckage, some making it ashore only to be captured or killed by English patrols and hostile Irish locals, who saw them as invaders. Others drowned in the furious surf, their bodies washing up along the beaches. One account describes how entire crews were lost in a single night, the sea swallowing hundreds of men at once. The cries of drowning sailors mixed with the roar of waves. A reminder that for all their cannons and courage, they were powerless against the forces of nature. In total, nearly 2/3 of the armada was destroyed during the retreat. Of the 130 ships that had proudly sailed from Spain, fewer than 70 limped home. Of the roughly 30,000 men who had set out, only about 10,000 returned alive. When the survivors finally staggered into Spanish ports, they were broken not just physically, but spiritually. King Philip II, upon hearing the news, is said to have responded stoically, "I sent my fleet against men, not against the wind and waves." His words captured the reality of the disaster at Spain had not been defeated by English firepower alone, but by the weather itself. For England, the defeat of the Armada became more than just a military victory. It was a moment of national identity. Elizabeth I presented herself as the Virgin Queen, blessed by divine providence, chosen to protect her people against overwhelming odds. Portraits of her began to include symbols of storms and broken ships, reminders that God or fate had intervened on England's behalf. The victory was immortalized in poems, sermons, and celebrations, shaping the myth of England as a nation destined to endure. But history, when viewed closely, reveals a more sobering truth. England's survival was as much about chance as it was about strategy. The weather, unpredictable and uncontrollable, had decided the outcome. Without the storms, Spain's vast resources might well have overwhelmed Elizabeth's fragile kingdom. In this sense, the Armada is not just a story of ships and cannons, but a reminder of how the natural world shapes human history. Standing on the cliffs of England today, it's easy to imagine the horizon filled with sails, the air heavy with smoke, and the sea alive with chaos. Yet what lingers most from the story of the Spanish Armada is not the clash of nations, or the bravery of sailors, but the raw, unrelenting power of wind and wave. The ocean, indifferent to kings and queens, wrote the final chapter, and so, the lesson remains. In the grand stage of history, the weather itself can become the most decisive force of all. Imagine leading the greatest army Europe had ever seen, marching into a vast, hostile land with dreams of conquest burning in your mind. Napoleon Bonaparte, at the height of his power in 1812, commanded an empire that stretched across the continent, and yet, despite his legendary strategic genius, he was about to face a force far more merciless than any army nature itself. The Russian winter, with its frozen rivers, relentless snow, and icy winds, would soon decide the fate of one of history's most ambitious military campaigns. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, known as the Russian Campaign or the Patriotic War of 1812, was born out of a complex mix of politics, pride, and economic pressure. The French emperor had imposed the continental system, a trade blockade designed to weaken Britain by cutting off its access to European markets. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, initially a reluctant ally, began to flout the blockade, trading with Britain and undermining Napoleon's plan. The emperor, furious at this breach of his economic strategy, decided on a direct, decisive response, a full-scale invasion of Russia to bring the Tsar to heel and restore his authority. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the Grande Army, a staggering force of over 600,000 men drawn from across Europe: French, Italians, Germans, Poles, and more. It was a multinational army unlike anything the continent had seen. Horses, cannons, wagons, and supplies stretched in a living line across the landscape. This massive force was a symbol of Napoleon's invincibility, a rolling empire on wheels, moving with precision and purpose. But from the very beginning, the campaign faced obstacles that no military genius could fully anticipate. Russia was immense, its geography sprawling and diverse, with forests, rivers, and steppe plains stretching for hundreds of miles. Supply lines were long, tenuous, and vulnerable. Each day of marching meant straining the limits of logistics, food, fodder, ammunition. and clothing had to be transported over distances that made even Napoleon's organizational skills struggle. The Russians, aware of the approaching threat, adopted a strategy that would later be called scorched earth. Villages were abandoned, fields burned, and supplies removed or destroyed to prevent the French from living off the land. It was a simple, cruel tactic. Deny the invaders sustenance, force them to overextend, and let the winter take its toll. For the soldiers of the Grande Army, this meant marching through increasingly desolate terrain, finding no food, no shelter, and little chance of replenishing their strength. As the army advanced, small skirmishes and harassment by Russian cavalry began to wear them down. These were not large-scale battles, but constant, exhausting encounters that forced the French to fight, march, and defend simultaneously. Horses grew thin from lack of forage. Soldiers' boots wore through, and morale started to waver. Napoleon, confident in his brilliance, believed that capturing Moscow, the spiritual and political heart of Russia, would force the Tsar to surrender. By September, after weeks of grueling marches and sporadic engagements, the French reached Moscow. At first, the city seemed an astounding prize, immense in scale, opulent, and symbolically powerful. But it was a city emptied of life. Tsar Alexander had ordered the evacuation of civilians, and the Russians set fire to Moscow as the French arrived. Flames devoured homes, warehouses, and food stores, leaving the invaders surrounded by smoke, ash, and hunger. Napoleon's supposed triumph was hollow. There was no welcoming population, no resources to sustain his army, only the bitter realization that winter was approaching and his supply lines stretched thin. As days passed, the Grande Army lingered in the smoldering city, hoping the Tsar would negotiate, hoping to salvage some form of victory. But Alexander I remained steadfast, refusing any diplomatic settlement. Meanwhile, the Russian winter began to make its presence felt. Subtle at first, cool nights, frost on the ground, but enough to signal danger. Clothing brought from Western Europe was ill-suited for the harsh conditions, and tents and encampments offered little protection. Napoleon, ever the planner, knew he could not afford a prolonged stay. Supplies were dwindling, morale was faltering, and disease began to spread among the crowded, starving troops. The army that had marched with confidence, dominating everything in its path, now faced an invisible enemy: the weather, the forests, rivers, and eventually the first snows of the Russian winter would become lethal. Horses would freeze, rivers would become obstacles, and the relentless cold would sap strength faster than any enemy's sword. By mid-October, Napoleon made the fateful decision to retreat. The army that had marched with pride into Russia would now attempt a perilous withdrawal across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The retreat promised not glory, but struggle, suffering, and unknown to Napoleon at that moment, catastrophe. And so, the stage was set. The proud Grande Army, once the most feared military force in Europe, was about to confront its greatest adversary, not another army, but the Russian winter itself. The unresolved question remains: could the Grande Army survive the bitter cold, the relentless Russian resistance, and the logistical nightmare of retreat? Or was Napoleon about to witness the collapse of his empire in the icy expanse of the Russian plains? The decision to retreat from Moscow in October 1812 marked a turning point, not only in the Russian campaign, but in Napoleon's entire career. For months, the Grande Army had marched with confidence, but now, with winter closing in, that confidence began to unravel. What followed was not just a military withdrawal, but one of the most harrowing ordeals ever recorded in the history of warfare. At first, the retreat seemed orderly. Napoleon hoped to march his men southward toward Kaluga, where reports suggested there were untapped supplies and safer routes. But Russian forces under General Kutuzov blocked the way. At the Battle of Mala-Yaroslavl, the French fought desperately to break through. The town changed hands several times in brutal street fighting. Houses set ablaze as soldiers battled through the smoke. Ultimately, Napoleon realized that pressing south was impossible. The French were forced back onto the same route by which they had entered Moscow. The Smolensk rode a path already stripped bare by the scorched earth policy. Here, the misery deepened. The first snows fell in early November. Temperatures plummeted, and men who had marched in light uniforms now found themselves exposed to cold that could reach 20 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, scraps of cloth, even straw, anything that might provide a barrier against the wind. Horses, vital for transporting artillery and wagons, began to die in droves. Without them, cannons were abandoned, supply carts overturned, and men were left to carry what little they could on their own backs. The starving army turned to desperate measures. Soldiers slaughtered dying horses for food, boiling scraps of meat and helmets. Leather straps and belts were chewed for any sustenance they might offer. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the ranks. The Grande Army, once an unstoppable force, was now a moving mass of suffering humanity, and the Russians gave them no rest. Cossacks, mounted warriors skilled in hit-and-run tactics, harassed the French columns constantly. They darted out of forests, cut down stragglers, and disappeared before any organized defense could be mounted. These attacks added terror to exhaustion for men already weakened by hunger and cold. The sudden cries of Cossacks charging from the snow were enough to shatter morale further. At Smolensk, Napoleon had hoped to find supplies stockpiled for the retreat. Instead, what awaited was disappointment. The warehouses held far less than promised, and much of it was already spoiled or looted. The city became a scene of chaos, with starving men rioting for crumbs of bread. Fires lit up the night as desperate soldiers tried to warm themselves, while others laid down in the snow and simply never rose again. The retreat became a nightmare of endless marches. Each step forward was a battle against exhaustion, hunger, and the biting cold. Roads turned to ice, rivers froze, and snowstorms blinded the weary troops. Men collapsed where they stood, too weak to continue. Entire units simply ceased to exist, reduced to scattered survivors trudging in silence. Yet perhaps the most infamous episode came at the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. Pursued by Russian armies, Napoleon's forces reached the river only to find the bridges destroyed, with no choice but to cross under fire. French engineers worked furiously to build makeshift bridges of planks and wagons, all while artillery shells rained down. Thousands of soldiers and civilians, camp followers, families, and servants who had accompanied the army crowded onto the fragile structures. Many fell into the icy waters below, swept away by the current, their screams drowned out by the roar of battle. Despite the chaos, Napoleon managed to get a portion of his army across, but at a horrific cost. Tens of thousands were lost in the Berezina crossing alone. The survivors pressed on, ragged and skeletal, their faces blackened by frostbite, their eyes hollow from starvation. By December, only a fraction of the Grande Army remained. Of the over 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, perhaps 100,000 had made it out of Moscow. By the time they reached the safety of friendly territory, fewer than 30,000 were still fit for combat. The rest were dead, captured, or incapacitated. The retreat from Moscow was no longer just a military failure, it was a humanitarian catastrophe. Soldiers who had once marched in triumph now looked like ghosts, and the myth of Napoleon's invincibility had been shattered. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, one question lingered. How had Napoleon, the master strategist who calculated every detail of his campaigns, underestimated the power of winter, the vastness of Russia, and the resilience of an enemy willing to sacrifice everything? By December 1812, the Grande Army was a shadow of its former self. Napoleon had survived, but his army, once the most formidable in Europe, had been decimated. The bitter Russian winter had claimed more lives than any enemy's sword, and the retreat had transformed a campaign of conquest into a catastrophic struggle for survival. As the army slowly made its way back across the frozen plains and forests, the survivors were a haunting sight. Soldiers walked in tattered uniforms, faces scarred by frostbite, eyes hollow from hunger and exhaustion. The dead were everywhere, frozen where they had fallen, abandoned along the roads, sometimes buried hastily by comrades who had neither the time nor the strength to provide a proper grave. Corpses of men and horses littered the landscape, a stark testament to the power of nature over human ambition. Napoleon himself was a man marked by the campaign, once so confident in his genius that he believed no army could oppose him. He now faced the humbling truth that even the greatest strategist could be undone by forces beyond his control. The Russian winter, the scorched earth policy, and the relentless harassment by Cossacks had combined into a perfect storm of disaster. His dreams of dominating Europe had survived the battlefield but had been wounded irreparably. Back in France, news of the retreat spread shock and disbelief. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered for the European powers. This failure inspired hope and emboldened enemies who had long feared the emperor's army. Political alliances shifted, rebellion stirred in occupied territories, and Napoleon faced the daunting task of rebuilding an army from the shattered remnants of the Grande Army. The Russian campaign left deep scars on both sides. Russia had defended its homeland, but at immense cost. Villages had been burned, fields destroyed, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The campaign demonstrated the brutal reality of war. Victory often comes at a price measured, not just in strategic gain, but in human suffering. The retreat from Moscow is remembered today not just as a military disaster, but as a powerful lesson in hubris and the limits of human ambition. It is a story that shows how even the most meticulously planned campaigns can collapse. When faced with nature as unpredictability, Napoleon's army, the pride of Europe, had been humbled by frost, hunger, and endurance itself. And yet, the campaign also highlights resilience. Those who survived. The retreat carried stories of unimaginable suffering, endurance, and determination. They returned to their homes forever changed, having witnessed firsthand how survival often depends not on strength or strategy alone, but on the ability to endure the relentless and different forces of the world. The ultimate question lingers in history's shadow. Had the Russian winter been milder? Had Moscow offered supplies? Could Napoleon have forced Russia to surrender? Or was the empire destined to face limits, no matter the genius of its commander? The answers remain unknown, leaving us to ponder the fragile line between ambition and disaster, and the invisible forces that shape the course of history. Imagine looking out across the Sea of Japan in the late 13th century, watching hundreds of ships approaching your shores. Each vessel brims with armed warriors, massive sails catching the wind, the sound of drums and horns filling the air. This is no ordinary fleet, it is the Mongol Armada, one of the most formidable military forces of the medieval world, coming to conquer your homeland. For Japan, a small island nation, the threat is unprecedented, and yet the outcome of this invasion will not be decided solely by swords or strategy. It will be decided by the fury of the skies. The Mongols, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, had already established an empire stretching from China to Central Asia, a vast domain unmatched in scale and military organization. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, sought to expand his empire further east. Japan, isolated and proud, had refused to submit to Mongol authority. Diplomatic attempts had failed, and the Japanese emperor had rebuffed Khan's emissaries with contempt. The Mongols, accustomed to obedience, saw this defiance as both an insult and a challenge. The only response, in their eyes, was force. In 1274, the first invasion fleet set sail. The Mongols had assembled around 900 ships and 40,000 men, including Chinese and Korean conscripts, catapults, and new forms of warfare that the Japanese had never encountered. This was a striking example of the Mongols' logistical brilliance. Ships were coordinated with precision, soldiers drilled in formation, and weapons designed to maximize devastation on land and sea. Yet, despite their power, they were entering unknown waters, navigating currents and tides far different from the rivers and plains of China and Korea. The Japanese defenders, though smaller in number and less equipped with advanced siege technology, relied on intimate knowledge of their terrain and seascape, coastal fortifications, hastily erected walls, and vigilant watchtowers gave them early warning of the approaching invaders. Samurai warriors, trained in archery, swordsmanship, and mounted combat, prepared to meet the Mongols not with numbers but with strategy and courage. Unlike the open plains where Mongol cavalry excelled, the Japanese islands offered narrow beaches, rocky coastlines, and defensive positions that could neutralize the enemy's advantage. When the Mongol fleet landed on the shores of Tsushima and Iki Islands, initial skirmishes were fierce. The Mongols unleashed their deadly weaponry, massive bows, catapults, and even explosive devices, and overwhelmed local defenders in some areas. The Japanese fought bravely, but were unfamiliar with the scale and intensity of Mongol warfare. In the chaos, the invaders sought to secure beachheads for further landings on the main island of Kyushu. The battle appeared as though it might be a decisive victory for the Mongols. But then, nature intervened. A violent storm swept across the region, lashing waves against the Mongol fleet, toppling ships and separating vessels from one another. Many ships ran aground or were smashed against rocks, scattering men into the freezing waters. The sudden, overwhelming force of the storm turned the tide, allowing the Japanese defenders to regroup and repel survivors. Within days, the first invasion had failed, not because of human skill alone, but because of the storm's devastating power. Undeterred, Kublai Khan planned a second invasion in 1281, determined to subdue Japan once and for all. This time, the Mongols assembled an even larger fleet, over 4,000 ships carrying 140,000 men, including Korean and Chinese forces, catapults, and supplies for months of campaigning. The scale was staggering, reflecting both the determination of the Mongols and their logistical mastery. Once again, however, they faced the challenge of navigating unfamiliar waters, unpredictable currents, and an enemy prepared to defend every inch of their coastline. As the second invasion fleet approached Kyushu, Japanese defenders had learned from the previous attack. Walls were reinforced along beaches, archers positioned for maximum effectiveness, and warnings of incoming fleets spread rapidly along the coast. Every strategy, every preparation aimed to delay and harass the invaders, buying time and relying on the hope that nature might once again intervene. In early August of 1281, the Mongol fleet made landfall at multiple points, initiating large-scale assaults. The fighting was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But the sea, unpredictable and unrelenting, soon became the true arbiter of the battle. A massive typhoon, later remembered in Japanese history as the kamikaze, or divine wind, struck with ferocity. Waves towered over the decks, ships were tossed like toys, and vessels broke apart, spilling thousands of men into the turbulent waters. The storm destroyed the Mongol supply lines, separated ships from their formations, and sent surviving soldiers scrambling for whatever land they could reach. By the time the typhoon subsided, the second invasion fleet was shattered. The Mongols retreated, humiliated and decimated. Their dream of conquering Japan finally dashed. For the Japanese, this was more than just a military victory. It was a moment that reinforced their belief in divine protection and the power of nature as an ally in defending their homeland. Yet the question remains, lingering through centuries: had the typhoon not struck, had the winds been calm and seas gentle, could the Mongols have finally succeeded? Would Japan have fallen under the vast shadow of Kublai Khan's empire, altering the course of history forever? After the near disaster of the first invasion in 1274, Kublai Khan remained undeterred. The Mongol leader had faced few defeats in his lifetime and viewed the failed landing as a temporary setback, not a permanent one. Over the next several years, he meticulously planned a second, far larger invasion, determined to bring Japan under his control. This campaign would require unprecedented coordination and preparation, showcasing the Mongols' remarkable military organization. The Second Fleet was massive, over 4,000 ships, and an army exceeding 140,000 men, including Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese conscripts. Supplies were stockpiled for months, catapults and siege engines loaded onto vessels, and troops drilled relentlessly in the techniques needed to breach Japanese defenses. The sheer scale of the invasion made it one of the largest amphibious operations in world history. Up to that point, Kublai Khan spared no expense, believing that overwhelming force could compensate for the mistakes of the previous attempt. Despite this meticulous preparation, challenges emerged immediately. The logistics of moving such a large fleet through unfamiliar waters were staggering. Ships collided, crews were exhausted before reaching land, and storms began to plague the voyage almost as soon as it departed Korea. Even without engaging the enemy, the sheer size of the armada made it vulnerable to the unpredictable currents and winds of the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese defenders had learned from the earlier attack. Samurai warriors had fortified key landing points along Kyushu, the southernmost of the main islands. Wooden palisades and earthen walls were constructed along beaches. Archers were stationed strategically, and lookout towers ensured that any approaching fleet would be spotted well in advance. Local fishermen, familiar with the currents and tides, provided early warnings of the advancing Mongol ships. Japan's approach combined preparation, knowledge of the terrain, and timing, turning the island's natural geography into a defensive advantage. When the Mongols landed in July 1281, the fighting was intense. The Japanese defenders resisted with precision, using longbows, spears, and strategic fortifications to slow the invaders' progress. Catapults and explosive devices from the Mongols inflicted damage. But Japanese resilience, combined with the difficulties of moving heavy equipment across narrow beaches, prevented the invaders from securing a decisive foothold. For days, both sides engaged in brutal skirmishes, each measuring the other's strength and endurance. But then, the sea itself intervened. A massive typhoon, the legendary kamikaze, struck the fleet with devastating force. Winds roared, waves towered above decks, and ships were thrown against one another and the rocky coastline. Vessels capsized, supplies were lost to the water, and thousands of men drowned. Even soldiers who reached land were often stranded, isolated from the main army, and vulnerable to Japanese counterattacks. The storm, indifferent to human ambition, did what neither samurai skill nor Mongol strategy could. It dismantled the armada in a single, unstoppable blow. The aftermath was catastrophic for the Mongols. Ships were scattered across the sea, crews decimated, and equipment lost. The survivors, clinging to wreckage or the shores of distant islands, were forced to retreat, humiliated and diminished. The second invasion had failed even more thoroughly than the first, not because the Japanese were invincible, but because the typhoon demonstrated the overwhelming power of nature against even the mightiest military forces. For Japan, the storm and the defeat of the Mongol fleet became a symbol of divine protection. The samurai and the civilians interpreted the event as evidence that the gods favored their homeland, a belief that would shape the Japanese understanding of both military defense and spiritual destiny. For centuries, fortifications were strengthened further. Lessons from the invasions were incorporated into military strategy, and the notion of Japan as an island blessed by divine winds entered the national consciousness. Yet, the story leaves us with an enduring question. If the typhoons had not struck, if the seas had remained calm, could Kublai Khan's overwhelming forces have finally conquered Japan? Would the entire course of East Asian history have been altered? Would Japan absorbed into the vast Mongol Empire? Or was Japan's survival ultimately a combination of preparation, resilience, and the sheer unpredictability of nature? By the late summer of 1281, after days of relentless fighting and with the Mongol fleet scattered by the fierce typhoon, it became clear that the second invasion of Japan had failed utterly. The ships that survived struggled to regroup, many heavily damaged, their crews exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Kublai Khan, watching from the distant shores of China, realized that even his unmatched military might could not overcome the combination of Japanese resilience and the fury of nature. The typhoon, remembered forever in Japanese history as the kamikaze, or divine wind, had destroyed the bulk of the Mongol fleet. Thousands of soldiers perished at sea, many swept away by the waves before ever setting foot on Japanese soil. Supplies sank, siege engines were lost, and coordination among the remaining troops collapsed. Those who did make landfall faced small but determined Japanese forces, now emboldened by the storm's devastation of their enemy. Resistance was relentless, and the Mongols had no option but to retreat, leaving Japan unscathed. For the Japanese, the victory was both practical and symbolic. The islands remained free of foreign rule, and the people believed the gods had intervened on their behalf. Coastal fortifications were reinforced in anticipation of future threats, and the legend of the divine winds became a cornerstone of national identity. Samurai warriors gained prestige, and the memory of the invasions would shape Japan's approach to defense for generations. The failed invasions also had consequences for the Mongol Empire. Kublai Khan's ambitions to expand eastward were checked, and the losses suffered by the fleet and army weakened his prestige and resources. The logistical and financial strain of such a massive military endeavor, combined with the failure to secure Japan, highlighted the limits of even the most powerful empire when faced with unpredictable natural forces. The Mongols had conquered vast territories on land, but the sea and the storms that ruled it proved unconquerable historically. These events demonstrate a striking truth: human ambition, no matter how meticulously planned, can be overwhelmed by the forces of nature. The Mongols, masters of the world's largest empire, could not account for the typhoons that shaped the fate of Japan. The samurai, while skilled and courageous, were aided by circumstances beyond their control. The intersection of human strategy and natural unpredictability determined the course of history, leaving a vivid lesson for generations to come. Even today, historians marvel at how these typhoons changed the trajectory of nations. Had the storms not struck, Japan might have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, altering the development of culture, politics, and military history in East Asia. The island's survival preserved their unique identity, and the legend of the kamikaze would resonate centuries later, influencing the Japanese psyche and even military strategy during World War II. In the end, the story of the Mongol invasions is not just about military might or strategy. It is about resilience, timing, and the unpredictable hand of nature. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by wind and wave as by sword and shield, and that survival sometimes depends on forces far beyond human control. And so we are left to wonder, if the winds had shifted differently, if the typhoons had not come, how different would the history of Japan and perhaps the world have been? Picture a damp, narrow battlefield in northern France, October 1415. Rain has turned the earth into thick, sucking mud, and a small, weary English army of around 6,000 men faces a massive French force, possibly 4 to 5 times larger. At first glance, the situation seems hopeless, yet history is about to demonstrate how determination, strategy, and an unexpected advantage can overturn overwhelming odds. The 100 Years' War had raged intermittently for nearly a century, a conflict driven by dynastic claims, territorial ambitions, and national pride. King Henry V of England, newly crowned and eager to assert his authority, had invaded northern France to renew hostilities and pressure the French crown. His army, though professional and disciplined, was far smaller than the French forces gathering in response. While French knights and nobles believed that their superior numbers and reputation would guarantee victory, Henry's men were armed with a combination of weapons and tactics that would soon prove decisive. Among the most significant assets in Henry's arsenal were the English longbows. These powerful, tall bows, wielded by archers trained from childhood, could launch arrows over remarkable distances with deadly accuracy. Unlike swords or pikes, which required close combat, longbows allowed the English to inflict significant casualties on enemy forces before they could even engage. The longbowmen were the backbone of Henry's strategy, forming a defensive line flanked by stakes to impede cavalry charges. The battlefield itself played an equally crucial role. Narrow, flanked by woods and hedges, the terrain constrained the movement of the larger French army. After days of rain, the ground had turned into a quagmire. Knights wearing heavy armor struggled to advance, their horses sinking into the mud. Even the most formidable cavalry charges were slowed and disrupted, making them vulnerable to arrow volleys. What might have been a decisive advantage for the French sheer numbers and elite cavalry was neutralized by the land itself. The French commanders, confident in their numerical superiority, believed they could overwhelm the English line through repeated charges and close combat. Knights rode forward in tight formations, followed by foot soldiers, expecting to crush the defenders with weight and force. However, the mud, the longbows, and the English stakes created a deadly combination. Horses became trapped or toppled, men slipped, fell, and became easy targets for the arrows raining down upon them. The battlefield's conditions amplified the effectiveness of Henry's smaller force, turning apparent disadvantage into opportunity. Henry himself understood the importance of morale and leadership. On the morning of the battle, he moved among his men, giving speeches and encouraging every soldier. He emphasized courage, unity, and the righteousness of their cause. This personal attention boosted morale and instilled a sense of purpose. For the English, victory was no longer simply a matter of survival, it became a shared mission. And their cohesion contrasted sharply with the disorganization of the larger French army, which struggled to coordinate its multiple commanders and divisions in the constrained, muddy terrain. As the French advanced, the English longbowmen released arrow after arrow, the sky darkened by projectiles. Many French knights fell before reaching the English lines, and those who survived became bogged down in mud, unable to maneuver or escape. The ground itself acted as a trap, amplifying the chaos and magnifying the losses. Every step forward became a battle against both the enemy and the land. By midday, the scale of destruction among the French forces was evident. Aristocrats and common soldiers alike were mired in mud, shot down by arrows, or trampled in the ensuing confusion. The English, relatively sheltered and positioned advantageously, inflicted losses that far exceeded their own casualties. The battlefield, narrow and treacherous, had turned into a natural amplifier of English tactics, making the improbable possible, a small army holding off and devastating a much larger one. Yet, despite these advantages, the battle was far from over. The French were resilient, relentless, and motivated by pride and obligation. Every moment of the English defense demanded precision, courage, and the effective use of terrain and weaponry. The question that hung over the muddy fields of Agincourt was this: could Henry V's smaller, exhausted, and outnumbered army withstand the French assault long enough to turn the tide completely in their favor? The unresolved thought remains: when sheer numbers meet strategic ingenuity, and the forces of nature, which prevails? And how close is history to being rewritten by what seems like chance? As the day progressed at Agincourt, the tension between the two armies escalated. Henry V's men, small in number but disciplined and determined, faced waves of French knights and soldiers pressing relentlessly forward. The rain-soaked battlefield had become a viscous trap. Every step the French took was slowed by deep mud, their heavy armor turning them into unwitting burdens. Horses, armored and massive, floundered, often falling with knights still in the saddle. The English longbowmen, positioned behind stakes and defensive lines, seized the moment with deadly efficiency. Each arrow volley from the longbows was devastating. Trained from youth, the archers could release 10 to 12 arrows per minute, creating a virtual storm of deadly projectiles. French knights, expecting close combat to play to their advantage, were cut down long before reaching the English lines. Many who survived the initial volleys became stuck in the mud, unable to move, turning them into immobile targets for the next wave of arrows. The combination of terrain, stakes, and missile fire decimated the attackers, while the English sustained relatively minimal losses. The French nobility, accustomed to dominance on open battlefields, were unprepared for such conditions. Command and coordination faltered amid the chaos. Leaders struggled to maintain control. Over-disoriented men bogged down in mud. The sheer scale of the French force, which should have been an overwhelming advantage, became a liability in the narrow, confined battlefield. Pride and tradition forced them forward, but the environment and English tactics systematically eroded their effectiveness. Amidst this carnage, Henry V's leadership became a critical factor. Mounted on horseback and constantly moving along the line, he inspired confidence and determination. Soldiers looked to their king as a symbol of hope and organization. Contrasting with the chaos among French ranks, Henry also utilized small units to exploit weaknesses in the French formation, coordinating archers and infantry to maintain pressure without overextending his limited numbers. This careful balance of offense and defense allowed the English to maximize their efficiency, turning strategy into survival. The mud, which began as a mere inconvenience, proved decisive. Knights and infantry struggled to advance, their momentum broken, formations disrupted. In some instances, horses sank into deep ruts, their riders falling helplessly, unable to rise. Every misstep amplified the lethality of the English arrows. Even well-trained soldiers found themselves trapped by terrain as much as by enemy weaponry. Mud, rain, and the longbows together created a perfect storm of disaster for the French army. The battle also revealed the limits of traditional warfare when confronted with unexpected variables. Heavy cavalry, long the backbone of French military power, was ineffective on the muddy field. Archery, long considered secondary, became the central weapon of destruction. Terrain dictated tactics, and improvisation became as critical as pre-planned strategy. The English had adapted to their circumstances, while the French relied on assumptions of superiority that the battlefield rendered irrelevant. By late afternoon, the French assaults had lost momentum. Losses among their nobility were catastrophic. Many high-ranking knights were killed or captured. The English, though exhausted and outnumbered, maintained cohesion and continued to inflict heavy casualties. The battlefield, once an open space favoring overwhelming numbers, had become a narrow corridor of death controlled by Henry's disciplined forces. Yet the struggle was far from over. Though the French had suffered immensely, they continued to press the attack, motivated by pride, obligation, and the desire to avenge fallen comrades. The English forces, small and fatigued, faced the challenge of holding their line without relief or reinforcements. Every arrow, every defensive maneuver, and every moment of courage mattered. The outcome of the battle was still uncertain, teetering between disaster and improbable victory. The unresolved thought remains: could a small, disciplined force truly crush a far larger, better equipped enemy? Or would exhaustion and sheer numbers eventually overwhelm even the most innovative tactics? As the sun began to set over the muddy fields of Agincourt, the battle reached its dramatic climax. The French army, though massive and equipped with the finest knights and soldiers of Europe, was thoroughly exhausted and disorganized. Their relentless charges had been broken repeatedly by the English longbowmen, whose arrows had cut down the advancing ranks, while mud and stakes had immobilized the heavily armored troops. The initial confidence of the French command had given way to confusion, frustration, and mounting panic. Henry V's leadership proved decisive. He remained visible to his troops, moving along the defensive lines, shouting encouragement, and reinforcing strategic points where pressure was greatest. His personal presence inspired courage and discipline among the English soldiers, enabling them to exploit every weakness in the French formation. As the French struggled in the mud, the English archers continued to fire relentlessly, while infantry units engaged those who reached the defensive lines. The battlefield had become a deadly funnel, where the French numerical advantage was neutralized and their losses escalated dramatically. By the end of the day, the results were staggering. Thousands of French soldiers, including a significant portion of the nobility, lay dead or captured. Entire families of knights have been wiped out in the mud and chaos. English casualties, by contrast, were remarkably low, a testament to both strategic foresight and the fortuitous conditions of the battlefield. The victory was not simply a triumph of weaponry, but of preparation, adaptation, and the ability to turn the environment itself into a defensive ally. The Battle of Agincourt became legendary, not only for the scale of the victory, but for the unexpected nature of it. It demonstrated that discipline, tactics, and terrain can overcome overwhelming odds. Henry V's army, though outnumbered, had achieved what seemed impossible, altering the course of the 100 Years' War and leaving a lasting impression on military history. The muddy fields of northern France became symbolic of how ingenuity and courage can prevail against raw power and size. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the battle reshaped perceptions of warfare in Europe. Heavy cavalry, once considered unstoppable, was shown to be vulnerable under the right conditions. Infantry and ranged units gained recognition as decisive components in battle. Leaders who understood terrain, weather, and logistics could exploit them to compensate for smaller numbers. Agincourt taught a crucial lesson. Victory does not always go to the largest or strongest army, but to those who anticipate, adapt, and endure. For centuries, Agincourt remained a symbol of underdog. Triumph, literature, art, and later films immortalize Henry V's courage, the muddy battlefield, and the relentless longbowman. The lesson of the day resonates even now. Preparation, resilience, and adaptability can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Yet history leaves us with a lingering question. How different might Europe have looked if the French had prevailed? Or if mud and longbows had not favored the English? Could Henry V's legend have existed without the perfect alignment of strategy, courage, and environmental fortune? The answer remains a tantalizing mystery, reminding us that even in war, fate and circumstance often wield as much power as skill and numbers. Imagine standing on the rolling plains of Balaclava and Crimea, October 25, 1854. You are a soldier in the British cavalry, mounted and armed, and your commander orders you to charge straight into a valley flanked on three sides by Russian artillery and infantry. The order seems questionable, even suicidal. But in the rigid structure of the military, hesitation is not an option. Ahead lies certain danger, but duty demands action. This is the beginning of what history would immortalize as the charge of the Light Brigade, a moment defined by bravery, confusion, and catastrophic planning. The backdrop for this charge is the Crimean War, a conflict largely fought over influence and the declining Ottoman Empire. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire faced off against Russia, each aiming to protect trade routes, maintain power balances, and prevent Russian expansion. On the battlefield, terrain, timing, and communication were critical. The British forces, although well-equipped and trained, were stretched across the harsh Crimean landscape, facing an enemy with both numerical strength and strategic positions in fortified areas. The Light Brigade, consisting of approximately 670 cavalrymen, was composed of lightly armed and mounted troops designed for speed and reconnaissance. Their horses were fast, and their weapons, lances and sabers, optimized for mobility rather than heavy confrontation. In theory, they were ideal for harassing enemy positions, pursuing retreating forces, or exploiting weak points, but their role in the impending charge would test both their training and courage to unimaginable extremes. On the morning of the battle, miscommunication set the stage for disaster. Orders intended to prevent Russian forces from capturing certain positions were either misunderstood or relayed incorrectly. Commanders at various levels interpreted signals differently, leaving the Light Brigade with vague and conflicting instructions. When the order to advance came, it directed them not toward a minor objective, but straight into the heavily defended Russian artillery positions across the valley. The landscape was deceptive. What appeared as an open field was actually a death trap, bordered by hills where Russian artillery could fire enfilade along the line of the advancing troops, maximizing casualties. The charge began with impressive precision and discipline. Horses thundered forward, their hooves kicking up dust and debris. Cavalrymen raised their lances and sabers, hearts pounding, fully aware that retreating was not an option. As they entered the valley, the enemy artillery opened fire. Cannons, rifles, and shelling tore through the ranks. Yet despite the chaos, the Light Brigade pressed on, maintaining formation and momentum. The bravery of the soldiers was remarkable, but it contrasted painfully with the lack of strategic foresight behind the order. Casualties began mounting almost immediately. Horses fell under cannon fire, men were struck down, and the narrow valley became a quarter of destruction. Soldiers who survived the initial volleys had to continue advancing, their courage tempered by fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that escape was nearly impossible. The bravery of the Light Brigade became both heroic and tragic, a testament to discipline under impossible circumstances, yet a stark example of how miscommunication and flawed planning can turn courage into catastrophe. Despite the heavy fire, the Light Brigade reached the Russian artillery positions and engaged briefly, their lances clashing against enemy forces. The encounter was intense but brief, as it became clear that holding the position was impossible. Orders to withdraw were finally relayed, and the survivors began the grueling retreat under continued fire. By the end of the charge, nearly half of the brigade was killed, wounded, or captured. Horses, vital for mobility, lay dead or dying across the valley, turning the field into a chaotic and tragic scene. The charge of the Light Brigade would be remembered for its extraordinary bravery, but also as a cautionary tale about the perils of miscommunication, hierarchical rigidity, and the devastating consequences of flawed command decisions. It was a battle where courage was unquestionable, but the planning was fatally flawed, and the terrain itself became an ally to the enemy rather than the soldiers. The unresolved thought remains: how could such a meticulously trained and disciplined military unit be led into near certain disaster? And what does this reveal about the interplay between leadership, communication, and human courage under fire? As the Light Brigade advanced across the open valley, the magnitude of the miscommunication became painfully clear. The order they had received was intended to prevent Russian forces from seizing the redoubts on the heights of Balaclava. Yet the vague phrasing and delayed clarifications directed them instead into the teeth of a well-prepared Russian artillery line. What should have been a tactical maneuver to control a minor position became a frontal assault against fortified guns, a battlefield catastrophe waiting to happen. The soldiers, however, pressed forward with remarkable cohesion. Each man understood the risks yet followed the code of duty, training, and honor. The disciplined formations of the cavalry were tested to their limits as they pushed through mud, shell fire, and the bodies of fallen comrades. Every step forward was a fight not just against the enemy, but against chaos itself. Commanders shouted orders across the field, attempting to maintain cohesion while artillery fire ripped apart ranks and horses fell beneath their riders. Despite their light armor and mobility, the Light Brigade encountered resistance that neutralized their strengths. Russian infantry lined the flanks, ready to exploit the narrow valley, while artillery raked the approaching soldiers from multiple angles. The English cavalry, built for speed and skirmish, found themselves slowed by the terrain and constrained by the compactness of the valley. The combination of heavy fire and difficult ground turned their advance into a deadly gauntlet. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism emerged. Soldiers carried fallen comrades, rallied around officers, and fought desperately to achieve their objective. Accounts from survivors later recounted men continuing the charge even after being wounded, their focus unwavering despite the carnage surrounding them. The courage displayed during those minutes would inspire generations, becoming legendary in British military history. Yet these moments of bravery were underscored by futility. The charge was not achieving its intended strategic aim, and losses mounted with each passing minute. Meanwhile, the British command structure struggled to adjust. Miscommunications persisted, and reinforcements were delayed or misallocated, signals intended to halt the advance or redirect. Troops were misunderstood or arrived too late. The rigidity of hierarchical military culture, combined with the fog of war, magnified the disaster. Leaders at the front were forced to make split-second decisions, often without the full picture, while commanders behind the lines grappled with the growing realization that the Light Brigade had been sent into an almost certain trap. By mid-charge, the Light Brigade had reached the Russian guns and engaged briefly, but the lack of infantry support and the relentless artillery barrage made holding the position impossible. The momentary clash, heroic yet brief, ended with the order to withdraw, retreat under fire, especially through the same exposed valley, proved nearly as deadly as the advance. Horses, exhausted and wounded, faltered. Soldiers struggled through mud and debris. The sounds of cannon, musket, and the cries of the fallen filled the valley. What began as a disciplined maneuver had devolved into chaos and survival. The psychological impact of the charge was profound. Survivors carried with them the memory of friends and officers struck down, the sights of mangled horses, and the overwhelming sense of the human cost of flawed orders. Yet, the discipline and courage of the Light Brigade became emblematic of unwavering commitment and duty. Even when faced with nearly certain death, their story would be told and retold, immortalized in poetry, art, and later historical accounts. The Battle of Balaclava and the charge itself reveal a stark truth about military operations. Courage, discipline, and loyalty can only compensate so much for poor planning, miscommunication, and adverse conditions. Even the most valiant soldiers cannot turn mismanagement into victory. The Light Brigade's experience underscores how leadership errors and misunderstanding of orders can convert bravery into tragedy on a monumental scale. The unresolved thought remains: could the charge have succeeded under different communication and leadership, or was the tragedy inevitable, revealing an unavoidable tension between duty, obedience, and strategic wisdom in war? By the afternoon of October 25, 1854, the Light Brigade had completed its fateful charge and begun the harrowing retreat back to British lines. What remained was a battlefield strewn with chaos, bodies, and the wreckage of horses, a grim testament to both human bravery and the devastating consequences of miscommunication. Nearly half of the approximately 670 cavalrymen were killed, wounded, or captured. Horses, essential to the cavalry's mobility, lay dead or dying, turning the valley into a macabre landscape of destruction. The charge, though heroic, achieved little in terms of strategic gain. The Russian positions remained largely intact, and the immediate objectives were unmet. Yet, the story of the Light Brigade would endure not for its success but for the extraordinary courage and discipline displayed under impossible circumstances. Soldiers followed orders with steadfast resolve, facing near certain death without hesitation, a striking example of loyalty, duty, and the harsh realities of military obedience. The British public, upon learning the news, was stunned. How could such a disaster occur and yet result in a narrative of heroism rather than shame? Poets like Alfred, Lord Tennyson, would immortalize the charge, praising the bravery of the soldiers, while subtly acknowledging the tragedy of flawed command. The event became a symbol of the complex interplay between valor and mismanagement, inspiring admiration, debate, and reflection across generations. The aftermath forced the British military to examine its command and communication structures. Errors that led to the charge highlighted vulnerabilities in order transmission, clarity of intent, and coordination across ranks. While bravery remained unquestioned, lessons were learned about the dangers of rigid hierarchy and assumptions in the heat of battle. Future military campaigns would take heed of the consequences observed at Balaclava, integrating better communication, reconnaissance, and situational awareness into operational planning. Yet beyond the strategic and historical implications, the charge of the Light Brigade reveals a timeless human story. It shows how individuals, bound by discipline and duty, can confront overwhelming danger with courage and cohesion. It also demonstrates that even exceptional bravery cannot always overcome flawed orders or poor planning. The valley at Balaclava serves as a reminder that history is shaped not only by heroism, but also by the decisions, mistakes, and miscommunications of leaders. The story concludes with a lingering reflection. The Light Brigade's charge is immortalized in memory not for its tactical success, but for its display of human courage and commitment. It prompts us to consider the delicate balance between obedience and judgment, courage and reason. In war, even perfect discipline cannot compensate for flawed leadership. Yet it is precisely the discipline that earns enduring respect and historical remembrance. The ultimate question remains: how should history remember moments where human bravery confronts inevitable disaster? And what lessons do they offer for leadership, strategy, and the human spirit? Picture the vast plains of Cannae in southern Italy, August 2nd to 16 BC. The sun beats down onto massive armies facing one another. On one side, the Romans are around 86,000 strong, well-equipped, disciplined, and confident in their overwhelming numbers. On the other, Hannibal's Carthaginian force, smaller, approximately 50,000 men, was composed of diverse troops, including cavalry, infantry, and mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. At first glance, the odds appear insurmountable for Hannibal. Yet history would soon reveal that ingenuity, strategic foresight, and psychological acumen could defy numbers and turn the battlefield into a deadly trap. The Second Punic War was at a critical stage. Carthage, seeking to expand influence in Italy and challenge Rome's growing dominance, relied on Hannibal's daring campaigns, crossing the Alps with elephants and troops. Hannibal had already achieved remarkable victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, demonstrating not only logistical genius but also the ability to adapt to unpredictable challenges. Each encounter had reinforced his reputation as a commander capable of turning adversity into advantage. At Cannae, Hannibal faced the ultimate test. The Romans, emboldened by previous victories and their superior numbers, were determined to crush Carthage once and for all. Their strategy relied on direct engagement, leveraging infantry strength to envelop and overwhelm smaller forces. Their commanders, experienced in standard Roman military doctrine, expected a conventional confrontation, confident that mass and discipline would prevail over clever maneuvering. Hannibal, however, had other plans. He understood that the Roman reliance on numbers and frontal assault could be turned against them. The terrain, a flat plain with slight undulations, and space for cavalry maneuvers, offered an opportunity for strategic encirclement. Hannibal carefully positioned his forces, placing weaker infantry in the center and stronger units on the flanks, while hiding elite cavalry on the wings. The goal was audacious: draw the Romans into the center, allow them to push forward, and then envelop them completely from all sides. It was a tactic requiring discipline, timing, and absolute coordination, a gamble that could either yield the most famous victory in military history or end in catastrophic defeat. The Carthaginian army was diverse, reflecting Hannibal's recruitment across regions. Spanish infantry, Gallic warriors, and African troops each brought unique skills. While some units were lightly armed and mobile, others were heavily armored and trained for sustained combat. The cavalry, particularly on the wings, was critical to the plan. Hannibal relied on their mobility to outflank the Romans, striking at vulnerable points and cutting off retreat routes. The integration of these forces into a coherent, flexible strategy demonstrated Hannibal's understanding of both human behavior and battlefield psychology. As the Romans advanced, confident in their numerical superiority, they pressed into the Carthaginian center. Hannibal's weaker troops absorbed the pressure, retreating gradually in a controlled manner, creating the illusion of weakness. The Roman commanders, perceiving success, ordered their soldiers to push harder into the apparent breach. They were falling precisely into the trap Hannibal had set. The battlefield, previously a mere stage, had now become an instrument of strategy, manipulated to turn overconfidence into vulnerability. By midday, the envelopment plan was in motion. Hannibal's flanking units, including cavalry, began to close around the advancing Romans. The soldiers who had pushed into the center found themselves increasingly hemmed in, surrounded on multiple sides. Panic and confusion began to spread as they realized the magnitude of the maneuver. Troop formations that had been steady moments before became chaotic, and the full impact of Hannibal's strategic genius started to unfold. Yet even as the encirclement progressed, a question lingered. Could a smaller, diverse force maintain cohesion long enough to execute such a complex plan against a disciplined, numerically superior enemy? The success of the battle depended not only on strategy, but also on timing, coordination, and the ability of Hannibal's soldiers to hold under pressure. A single misstep, hesitation, or miscommunication could turn triumph into total annihilation. The unresolved thought remains: how would history judge Hannibal if this audacious plan failed? And could a commander truly manipulate human behavior and battlefield conditions so precisely that sheer numbers no longer guaranteed victory? As the Roman legions pushed deeper into the Carthaginian center, the true brilliance of Hannibal's strategy began to reveal itself. The gradual, controlled retreat of his center had created a pocket that drew the Roman infantry further forward, stretching their formations and overextending their lines. Roman commanders, confident in the sheer mass of their troops, did not anticipate that they were advancing into a carefully prepared trap. Each step they took played into Hannibal's hands, tightening the net of encirclement that would soon envelop them completely. On the flanks, Hannibal's stronger infantry and cavalry units began their decisive maneuvers. The African infantry, disciplined and heavily armed, moved inward to compress the sides of the Roman advance. Meanwhile, the elite cavalry, positioned strategically on the wings, executed a sweeping motion around the Romans. The combination of lateral pressure and forward momentum created a deadly pocket. The Romans, who had believed they were advancing on a collapsing center, now found themselves encircled on all sides. Panic started to spread among the ranks. Soldiers who had been confident and organized moments before were now hemmed in, trapped by the very strategy that had lured them forward. The psychological impact of this encirclement was immediate and devastating. Roman discipline, so effective in open field engagements, faltered under the sudden realization of entrapment. Units began to break apart, some attempting desperate charges to escape the tightening ring. Others were cut down by the well-positioned Carthaginian infantry, while cavalry closed in to prevent retreat. Hannibal's coordination ensured that pressure was applied uniformly, leaving no weak points for the Romans to exploit. Each maneuver capitalized on the enemy's assumptions, overconfidence, and inability to adapt quickly. Hannibal's genius lay not only in his understanding of terrain and troop movements, but also in his manipulation of human behavior. By appearing weaker in the center, he lured the Romans into overextending themselves, making them vulnerable to flanking and rear attacks. Soldiers who believed they were on the verge of victory suddenly found themselves trapped, facing attacks from all directions. The timing of the encirclement was critical. Move too early, and the trap would be incomplete. Move too late, and the Romans could recover. Hannibal's patience, foresight, and discipline allowed him to execute one of the most perfect tactical maneuvers in military history. As the afternoon wore on, the Romans struggled in the deadly pocket. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear began to sap their morale. The dense formations that had been their strength became a liability, as Carthaginian infantry pushed inward and cavalry cut off escape routes. The flat plains of Cannae, initially a stage for combat, now served as Hannibal's instrument, dictating movement, limiting options, and amplifying the effectiveness of his smaller force. Despite the encirclement, some Romans attempted to fight their way out. Individual acts of valor occurred as soldiers tried to break the Carthaginian lines or protect comrades. Yet, without coordinated leadership and facing overwhelming pressure from multiple directions, these efforts were ultimately futile. The trap that Hannibal had set was nearly perfect. The Romans could neither advance nor retreat without incurring massive losses. By late afternoon, the Carthaginian army had achieved what many had believed impossible. A smaller, diverse force had annihilated a numerically superior, disciplined Roman army through superior strategy, timing, and understanding of both terrain and human psychology. The battlefield became a testament to Hannibal's tactical brilliance, demonstrating that victory is not determined solely by numbers, but by planning, execution, and the ability to manipulate the conditions of engagement. The unresolved thought remains: could any force, no matter how disciplined or numerous, have escaped Hannibal's encirclement, or was this battle destined to illustrate the terrifying power of perfect strategy? By the late afternoon, the Roman legions at Cannae were fully enveloped. Hannibal's encirclement was complete, and the battlefield had become a scene of overwhelming devastation. Roman soldiers, trapped on all sides, were unable to coordinate a counterattack or retreat. Panic spread through the ranks, and the disciplined formations that had once been their greatest strength disintegrated under pressure. The Carthaginian army, executing its plan with precision, systematically reduced the trapped Romans, leaving thousands dead or captured. The casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers perished that day, one of the highest losses in a single engagement in ancient history. Hannibal's army, though smaller in number, had suffered relatively minimal losses, demonstrating the effectiveness of his strategy and the devastating consequences of being outmaneuvered. The battlefield became a grim testament to the power of tactical genius, preparation, and the disciplined execution of a complex plan. Hannibal's victory at Cannae had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Rome, shaken by the scale of the defeat, faced panic and political turmoil. Many of Rome's allies began to reconsider their loyalty, fearing Carthaginian supremacy. Yet, despite this monumental loss, Rome ultimately survived. The city adapted its military strategies, avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal for several years, and eventually turned the tide of the Second Punic War. The battle, while a tactical masterpiece, did not translate into strategic victory for Carthage, a reminder that even perfect execution on the battlefield does not guarantee the larger war outcome. The genius of Cannae lies not only in Hannibal's strategy, but also in the lessons it offers for military thinking and leadership. The ability to manipulate enemy assumptions, to control terrain, and to coordinate diverse forces with precision is as relevant today as it was over 2 millennia ago. Hannibal demonstrated that numbers alone do not dictate outcomes. Creativity, patience, and psychological insight can shape the fate of nations. The story of Cannae also emphasizes the human element in warfare. Soldiers on both sides faced exhaustion, fear, and chaos. Decisions made by commanders, from the high-level planning to battlefield adjustments, determine survival and death. Courage and discipline could only go so far when strategy and environment conspired against you. The battle serves as a timeless lesson in the interplay between leadership, human behavior, and the brutal realities of conflict. Even today, military historians study Cannae as a blueprint for tactical brilliance. The encirclement technique, known as a double envelopment, is taught in academies around the world. Hannibal's ability to turn numerical inferiority into decisive advantage remains a standard example of genius in warfare. Yet, the haunting question lingers: how much of history is shaped by such moments where skill, insight, and circumstance converge to create outcomes that seem almost inevitable in hindsight? And so we are left to ponder: could any army, however disciplined, have escaped Hannibal's trap? Or was the destruction at Cannae a perfect storm of strategy, psychology, and human limitation that history could not alter?